tokenomics. So I think it's important to kind of think about the term DAO as a guidepost or like a compass as opposed to the final destination.
Thank you for taking your time out and joining, Chase. It's lovely to have you here.
Yeah, I'm excited to chat. I feel like this will be fun.
Awesome, awesome, awesome. So, guys, if you don't know, I'll just give a small introduction of what we're doing. This is Web3 with Dhee. This is the Twitter spaces we host almost every day. With different guests discussing different interesting topics. Today we have Chase Chapman with us, who is constantly writing, thinking, and talking about DAOs. And yeah, she's a like she's contributing to like all these major DAOs with IndexCoop, Orca, Rabbit Hole, and also is a co-founder at Decentology. Yeah, but now she's an advisor and she runs her own podcast called The Other Side, which is also super interesting. You should check it out. Chase, would you like to give a small introduction about yourself?
Sure, I think you gave a pretty good introduction. Yeah, I'm doing a lot of DAO stuff, which has been really fun. Thinking mostly about the human side of Web3 and how we engage in this entire like world that we're building, and a lot of that is focused on DAOs, which has been really fun.
Yo, sorry, I was muted. This happens sometimes. I have to click the link multiple. Sorry. Anyway, so Chase, what were you doing before you got into crypto or Web3? And yeah, like that. If you can give like a small introduction story.
Yeah, so before crypto, I was working in marketing, doing like data analytics actually while I was in college. And we had a lot of challenges with like data provenance and who owns data. And that's actually where I first learned about crypto. And at the time, it was like blockchain will be this perfect solution to the data provenance problem. And so I really fell down the rabbit hole there, got involved with She256, which is an organization that matches like women who want to get more involved in the space with mentors. I was matched with an amazing mentor who I ended up starting Decentology with when I was in college, which was amazing. We built that. They're still doing amazing things around smart contract development, sort of ecosystem development of smart contracts and auditing and all of those things. So that was really fun. And then I took a little bit of a step back as a founder. I'm now an advisor there, like you said, and really dove deeply into DAOs. But when I was in high school and all of that stuff, I was always very interested in like model UN and economics and all these things. And so I think DAOs are very much the perfect intersection of these like human systems, like, you know, the United Nations, and economic systems. So that I think was really appealing to me. And when I started seeing all the stuff that was happening in the DAO ecosystem, I just felt like I couldn't not do something. And so that's kind of where I am now.
That's awesome. And like even I studied psychology as my major, and like I was also studying politics and economics as like minor subjects to go with it. And I like I think like DAOs are like super interesting. I was always interested in like organizational behavior and whatnot. So like this is why I find like DAOs to be super interesting. Anyway, Chase, tell me something. Like, I want to know a little bit history of not you about like DAOs, right? Like maybe we have been using this terminology very recently. But like in human, I mean, if you are aware, right? Like you are a person who I think would know this. In human history, have these concepts like DAOs existed, where like people like did things without like someone leading them, or maybe even before that, like could you explain what a DAO is, and then I can ask you the history question.
Yeah, I definitely don't claim to be a historian of decentralized organizing because I think humans in a lot of different contexts have been doing this for a long time. But I guess starting with the definition of a DAO, I think this is like such a big conversation right now. And I guess I'll preface my definition with something that I've been thinking about a lot, which is every word that we use is a guidepost for the most part, particularly words that don't have hard technical implementations. Like NFTs have much more tangible technical implementations where, you know, um, there's specs. So ERC 721 and 1155 are specs that make NFTs very clear. I think something like a DAO is a lot more broad, and you can ask 100 different people for the definition of a DAO, and they're going to tell you 100 different things. So I think it's important to kind of think about the term DAO as a guidepost or like a compass as opposed to the final destination, because every DAO is going to look different. But DAO stands for Decentralized Autonomous Organization. Generally, what that means is you have a group of people who are coordinating and organizing towards some mission or goal or shared context together. And there typically isn't a single person who's telling everyone what to do, which is not to say that there aren't leaders. It just means that individual contributors have autonomy to make decisions. And that's done often in a decentralized manner. So when we think about the original DAO, that was sort of an investment DAO where you had people pooling capital together, deciding on what should be invested in. But you also have DAOs like Uniswap or others where you actually have a smaller team building product and then token holders making decisions about certain aspects of the ecosystem. So there are a lot of different kinds of DAOs, but more broadly, I think it's about an organization that's owned by people who are not just a small group, but instead people who create value in these organizations, people who are partners, people who provide capital, and they actually have a say in how the organization is run.
Awesome. I think that sums up what we discuss generally. So I mean, I want to ask you why, what are these pros, what people say that DAOs are better than traditional organizations. Can you talk about some differentiations between them?
Yeah, I mean, I think like what a traditional organization is an interesting question, right? Because there is, of course, no single organization. I think one of the big reference points that we currently use in DAOs is Web 2 tech companies. I feel like that's the new quote unquote traditional organization, which is kind of funny when you think about how new a lot of these organizations actually are in the grand scheme of things. But I think that there are a few key differences that DAOs push. And like more broadly, it might be interesting to explore the context that I think really matters for where DAOs came about, or I suppose like not where they came about, but the context that we're in today in general. So I think when we look at how companies are run, I think there's been a really big push over the past couple of decades towards more self-managing organizations where you don't have this really rigid hierarchy, but instead you acknowledge that when you give employees of companies autonomy to make decisions and to execute in ways that they think are important for the organization, you often get better outcomes because you're not relying on a single CEO or board to make decisions in specifically like contexts that they are not experts in. So I think we've seen a lot of that. Zappos very famously stewarded a more flat organizational model and I think the early 2000s, and now that's sort of pulled out into a lot of other parts of a lot of big organizations that come to mind today. So we really have seen this move towards more flat organizations, more employee autonomy. And then I think the second piece that's been really important is the pandemic really catalyzed this concept of rethinking how we work. So, we have the Great Resignation, we have people considering this ability to have more flexible jobs, whether it's because they're working from home or more broadly in this like gig economy context. We're really like rethinking work. And so I think DAOs have emerged over the past, 6 months to a year in a much larger way because of all of these sort of all of these contextual things that are pushing towards more autonomy and more ownership for employees. Even when you think about the way that startups distribute equity and the way that newer companies distributed equity in the 50s, 60s, 70s to today, you have more employees owning larger portions of companies. And so I think we're really taking that to the 10th degree. And to me, that's one of the biggest things that makes DAOs different from a lot of other types of organizations, is this idea that the people who create value are the ones who actually own the organization and have governance power and have the ability to really decide how things are run. And then I think the second piece, which I kind of touched on in this context of more flat organizational design, is this notion that people have autonomy, that you don't have a single CEO who tells everyone what to do, and all that stuff. So like my two foundations that make DAOs different from a lot of orgs are those two things: ownership and self-management.
This podcast was possible because of our sponsors, Brave and Unstoppable Domains. More about them next.
Crypto scams are like box of chocolates. You never know which one you're gonna get. Especially if you're using a crypto wallet, which is a browser extension. You run the risk of attacks like phishing scams, account spoofing, data leaks, and theft. The best way to avoid getting attacked is using Brave Wallet. Brave Wallet is the first secure crypto wallet built directly into a browser, so no extensions required. With Brave Wallet, you can buy, store, send, and swap assets. You can even manage your portfolio and NFTs all in one place. Whether you're new to crypto or a seasoned pro, it's time to switch to Brave Wallet. Download Brave at brave.com/web3withdhee and click the wallet icon to get started. You know what's the worst part about crypto? These long and complex wallet addresses. They can get so confusing. I know, you hate them too. What if I told you I replaced my long wallet address with dheerajshah.nft? Yeah, that's my name. All thanks to Unstoppable Domains. They're the #1 providers of NFT domains. With Unstoppable Domains, you don't have to worry about renewal fees because you get to keep your NFT domain forever. You can get an NFT domain as well, maybe a .crypto, .nft, .x, or something else. Go to unstoppabledomains.com right now and get your NFTs for as low as $5.
Chase, you had posted like something about mental models. I would like to know a little bit more about, because for a lot of period of time, right, like DAOs were called, or like these are permissionless networks or decentralized protocols, right? Like, but you are suggesting that we change using these terminologies and use terms like self-managing organizations or sociocracies or co-ops, right? Like, so like I think this is also very fundamental conversation we need to have when when we talk about DAOs. So what is your thought process when you thought about this, and what should people need to know about thinking about DAOs as a subject?
Yeah, I think for the past like almost 10 years, we've been thinking about decentralized networks mostly in the context of protocols and computational models like Bitcoin and Ethereum. And, for so long, a lot of these conversations were a lot more about the technology than the people. And rightfully so, because we didn't really have that many people or culture that was built on top of these things that was like really tangible. There was always this like push for needing use cases. And I think we're finally at the point where we have the use cases, at least some of them. Whether that be some of the communities that have popped up around NFTs or DAOs that are building products or protocols. And what I think that's forced as like a rethinking is maybe computational models are not the perfect way to think about very human systems. And so I think we still adopt a lot of these systems around like permissionless networks and things like that, which are useful in some ways, but there are a lot of limitations of thinking that way. One of them being like Bitcoin as a network is maximizing decentralization. The nodes in the network have a very limited scope of the type of work that they can do. And humans just don't work that way. Like you might have a human who does marketing and another human who does software development. And there are very specific niches even within those. And so there are elements of the system that are just quite different. And I think it's okay to apply computational models to DAOs, but I think that there's a limit on how helpful they are. And I think we really over-index on them right now. So when we think about what are the best mental models, we can shift a little bit more towards other types of decentralized like systems for organizing that have really focused on the human level. So when I think about things like co-ops, sociocracy, self-managing organizations, all of these things have been like experimented with and people have learned a lot from. And I think now it's a matter of trying to sort of marry these two worlds where we can say, okay, what can we learn from the very human ways that, or the more human approach to organizing, which has like empirical data, as opposed to taking much more like computational models that has empirical data also, but at a computational level, not necessarily at a human level. And I think we're learning, like there are certain things that just don't work. For example, totally permissionless networks where anyone can spin up a node and start mining in the Bitcoin network. That doesn't work in DAOs because you have this element of trust that's really important. That on the Bitcoin network, like basically proofs make sure that trust is maintained, but you don't have that with humans. Like you can't just create a mathematical proof on whether or not you should trust someone and whether or not their work is correct or not. And so I think those are the elements where things get a lot more complex.
Wow, that's good to hear. And I like you could see, right, like people also were resonating with what was being said. And I think, yeah, like we've been the industry has been very much dominated by people who were in tech, like you said, rightfully so, right, like because maybe that was the need. But like now we have a lot more people who are non-techie, who are into the space, who are building DAOs, who are building NFTs, or adding more layer than just tech. So like we need to think of these models in a different way. Chase, I have a okay, guys. Before I ask the next question, like if you're learning something or enjoying this chat, uh, do retweet or tweet about this space. Tag me and tag Chase, and let your friends and other people know if they are interested about DAOs. They can join this conversation. Chase, I have one more question for you. In last few months or like a last year or so, every company, uh, every project which is starting, they are claiming to be a DAO. Every pitch you see is like, "Hey, we are making a DAO," and like, what do you have to say to to that? And like, what are your observations? What's happening?
I think it's really exciting. I think that right now, because the word DAO is this like guidepost, what we're seeing with everyone saying, we're going to ultimately become a DAO is this notion of users will ultimately own and have space to govern what we're building. And right now, the way that we have to describe that, the terminology that we have is DAO. I think over time, people won't need to call themselves DAOs because almost everything will be in some form embodying the concept of DAOs. So, like, I think when we talk about what Web3 really means, when again looking like what the pandemic has done and where we're at, we spend so much time online. And I think one of the things that's really exciting about Web3 is it respects that we're spending so much time on these platforms and says, you are now a citizen of crypto Twitter, for example. Like you spend so much time on crypto Twitter. If you spend at least 2 or 3 hours a day on crypto Twitter, you are a citizen, like fully. And you have the right, or you should have the right, to govern how these spaces are built. Because if, what is 1/6 of your life? If you spend 4 hours a day on crypto Twitter, that's 1/6 of your life. You should probably have a voice in how these platforms are built. And so when I think about what it really means for everyone to say they're a DAO, it's acknowledging that digital spaces should be governed by those who inhabit them. And I think it's, of course, like, yes, kind of buzzwordy, but ultimately what I hope that is really a reflection of is a shift in the way that we think about who has a voice in what we're building. And again, like I think, right now, because we're in this weird transition between a very small group of people or a company controlling these spaces, slowly moving more towards like a more democratic lens on digital spaces, we have this weird moment where it's like, how do you signal that you intend to be more democratic? You call yourself a DAO. But longer term, I don't think that's really what's going to happen. I think people will just be expected to do that. It will be actually really strange, I think, to have a small group of people who make all of the calls on how these platforms are built and how the space exists.
Okay. So all this sounds wonderful, but are there any things which you hate currently about the entire DAO ecosystem? And yeah, I would like to know.
Hate's a strong word. I don't think I hate anything. I think that
Don't uh, uh, at
there
a
are things. Oh, go ahead. I think there are things that are going to be challenging, or that are currently challenging. I think that there are a few big misconceptions and problems that we're currently trying to work through. I will say as like a quick note, something that I'm not a fan of with regards to people calling themselves a DAO is it's totally fine to progressively decentralize into a DAO. I think that that is a model that there isn't a super clear playbook for, but that a lot of people are experimenting with. At Orca, we're experimenting with this, and it's been really interesting. Index kind of effectively did this because Set Protocol sort of, or Set Lab sort of seeded Index, and that has gone, quite well. So I think that like there's a movement towards thinking about progressively decentralizing. Something that I'm not a big fan of is completely saying that you're a DAO and like acting like you're decentralized, and then really having a smaller group of people calling the shots and making the decisions under the guise of being a DAO. So I think one thing that I'm not quite a big fan of that I think we need to shift a little bit is really making the power dynamics in these communities explicit. So if you're an organization that is a company that's sort of progressively decentralizing to a DAO and starting to build out your community, I think you need to be really explicit about the domains that the company owns and executes within, and the domains that the DAO owns and executes within. And I think when you don't have that clarity, that's how you end up having sort of a really like uncomfortable power dynamic situation that starts to feel less healthy. I think another thing that's challenging from my perspective is we need to work through a little bit more of what permissionless really means in DAOs. I think the narrative that we currently push is this notion that anyone can contribute and anyone can step up. And like I have also pushed that narrative in the past because that was sort of my perception based on the DAOs that I was involved in early on. But I think as organizations, especially as they grow, you do have to be more intentional about who is a contributor. And you don't have to, I don't think that necessarily means you have to do that at a community level. Like I think the notion of permissionless contributions could mean that you can be a permissionless contributor to vibes in the community. And I think that can totally work. But I do think that we need to be a little bit more intentional about who we let in and how we talk about these things. Because right now the narrative around anyone can step up and contribute is kind of like misleading to people, and I think that that's something that we need to get better about. Again, I'm personally a big fan of having a spectrum of these things, but that's not inherent to DAOs. So I think that's a narrative that needs a little bit more shaping and fixing and ironing out.
Yeah, that makes sense. And um see, there is, like, again, this is something you've written about, like, but I just want to add on, like, maybe this is a problem which I think, or like, maybe it is not, but like, let's say, hey, I own certain tokens of like a certain DAO, and like, there are these voting decisions, and maybe, like, I'm not even, so basically people talk, like, in DAOs the voting percentage is very low, right? Like, so what do you think, right? Like, when people own these tokens but they don't participate in DAO, like, what happens, and what do you think about it?
Yeah, voter apathy is, and like just inactivity is a challenge in DAOs. I think to me, when people are not voting, when you have like a large percentage of token holders who do not vote, and you have a lot of proposals that are being passed, or you're not reaching quorum, that indicates to me, like, I think it's a symptom, not the core problem. And that indicates to me that there's more work to be done on the governance system. So personally, I think that a lot of decisions that are currently being made at a token holder level should be made at a smaller group level. And when I say smaller group, I do not mean centralized party. I mean effectively groups of people who are delegated decision-making and execution power who are chosen by token holders. So I think that's something that needs a lot more attention, is how do you decide, who has control over a DAO's Twitter? Like, token holders currently obviously don't vote on every tweet, and they shouldn't. How can we take that type of model where you trust someone to act like in a way that is in line with what the DAO wants, and you have this sort of trusted delegated party doing certain things? And I think we need that at a more broad level for a lot of things. I think every DAO is going to find a balance between token holder voting and contributor decision making. And I think even among contributors, you need governance mechanisms. I'm a big fan of like consent-based governance at the contributor level, for example. So I think we can leverage different governance models. But I think a lot of the challenge with voting today is actually that we expect token holders to vote on like super niche issues when we probably shouldn't be doing that.
That's hey, you said something very interesting, I think, which stuck with me, is like, your token holders don't need to vote on every tweet your DAO makes, right? Like, and I think that's just a good takeaway from this conversation. Like, people can go into, like, it's better to give out the power to do and to, like, control and execute certain things, and like, that could be voted on by the people, and it makes sense, right? Like, it makes everyone's lives easier, and not everyone has expertise in everything. So yeah, it makes sense. All right. um just give me a second. I'm just checking like my list of questions, and what do I ask you? Okay, so I'll ask you nothing from my list. Is basically, tell me, like, you've been podcasting for quite some time, and what are some things you learned only because you were podcasting? Otherwise, as a contributor, you would have never thought of it, right? Like, so what are some learnings you got as a podcaster or a content creator?
I think tweeting and doing my podcast and stuff like that has been a really interesting way to straddle this line between practice and theory. So, and sort of reflecting. So, like, a lot of what I've done over the past few months is contribute to DAOs, test out different models, experiment and really practice this stuff, and then synthesize and reflect and share learnings. And going back and forth between those things has been really eye-opening for me as a space to really think about what are we doing, and intentionally think about how the different things that we're doing in DAOs today do and don't work. And that's been really, really nice, because I think sometimes people who are really deep in being practitioners don't always have the space to reflect. Like, you're on Discord all the time, it feels like there's so much to do, and you don't create that space, and you don't have the opportunity to really think critically about what you're doing. I think on the other side, you have people who are thinking really critically about these things in theory, but don't see where those models break in practice. And so I think actually, like, creating content has made this really interesting dynamic emerge for me, where I can sort of theorize and then practice. It's almost like I'm like a scientist in a lab, where I come up with a hypothesis and then I test that hypothesis and see what worked and what didn't. And then I reframe my hypothesis and then I go back and test. And that's been really, really cool to do and very enlightening for me when I think about how these things are working tactically and in practice and all of that kind of stuff.
Very cool. Very cool. And like, do you enjoy like forming all these hypotheses and whatnot?
Do I enjoy doing what?
Do you enjoy coming up with theories, different theories, and then like, oh, this worked and this didn't work, and then like I have to think more about all of this?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is like, it's interesting. A lot of my taking it back to the theory element comes from what I see other people do. So like in Index, we have experimented with a lot of different compensation models. And much of my thinking on compensation was driven by observations in the Index community and then trying to synthesize and understand how I personally engaged with that, how other people engage with that, thinking about how self-managing orgs have dealt with it, and then going back and being like, okay, what's happening now? And Brad from Index has been fantastic about like really pushing experiments within the community nest on things. So he's like driving a lot of this stuff. And then I'm able to observe what he's done and then go back and think about it. And so I think a lot of it is really like trying to synthesize and pull conclusions out of something that I observe, as opposed to just being like, I'm going to theorize about this like grand thing. Instead, it's kind of like, what are the tensions that I personally feel as a DAO contributor? And then going to the theory and saying, okay, how have people solved this in other organizations? Sort of synthesizing and thinking about it and then pulling it back and trying it in practice. So a lot of it has been really observation based, which I think has worked really well because, again, it just becomes this practice of sensing tension, doing a little bit of research and talking and thinking about how that tension has arisen in other communities and how we might, or arose, whatever the right word is, and how we might play around with really like sort of reworking our approach and then going back and trying it. And that's been really a cool way to navigate the space.
Yep, that makes sense. So why do you think that governance tokens should be inflationary, or what is an like ideal system, or which like maybe what you think right now of governance tokenomics? If I hope that's not like too heavy.
Oh no, I don't think nothing's too heavy for DAO conversations. Yeah, I think some governance tokens should be. I think inflationary tokens is one option, I guess, would be the way that I frame it. Or I should be framing it because I haven't always done that in the past. So I think that what's currently happening in a lot of DAOs is that you have an early group of contributors who do a lot of the work setting up a DAO. They take a pretty high risk, which I want to acknowledge, but they often get like a really large percentage of the token supply of the governance tokens. And I think the challenge with that when we think about longevity of a DAO is that you have a very small group of people who often don't have like a vesting, sort of a vesting period like, traditional founders might have. They might not be getting diluted nearly as much as you would have for traditional founders. And ultimately, a lot of these people might not be there anymore because, whether it's because you don't have the vesting schedule or just the way that DAOs create a much more like fluid model of work, it's just really challenging to have these like large token holders who might not stay engaged and aligned or even be the ones who have the most context in things. And when you think about what a token really does, it provides the ability to control where the organization is going and have a voice that's heard louder than other people. And sometimes that's useful for people who have really high context, who really want the organization to succeed and have like a really deep understanding of what that might look like and what the org needs. But a lot of times the people who hold the most tokens are not always the people who have that perspective. And again, I don't think this is like across the board. I think it's more about acknowledging that new contributors come in who might have higher context, and it's really important to consider that those people should have a voice that is heard and heard in a way that's meaningful. And so I think inflationary governance tokens are a really interesting model because what you allow essentially to happen is you slowly dilute people who are no longer actively involved. and you start to allocate more tokens towards people who are actively involved. And again, that doesn't mean that you like totally cut out early contributors. It doesn't mean that early contributors don't get as many tokens, because if they're actively involved, they can keep their supply and allocation, and that's all good. But I think we need better ways to sort of make the allocation of tokens across governance more dynamic. And that's why inflationary tokens are really exciting to me. I think how this looks is going to be really different. I don't know exactly, but I'm very hopeful that this is one of those things that will really help incentivize current contributors, but also just like allow them to have governance power in an organization that they care about.
Hey, awesome. That makes sense. Are there any alternate theories, I mean, models you think which can incentivize, like, the people who have just joined in and like are energetic and like, not necessarily the older ones, apart from inflationary tokenomics?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the inflationary tokenomics thing, like I mentioned incentives, but I think the real reason that it's exciting is not necessarily incentives and price. It's more about people who are most actively involved having a large ability to influence governance. And I think that that's really what inflationary tokens are about, is just like giving people with the most context more say, or more influence in how governance works. I think that you can do this in other ways. Like I've seen and had conversations with organizations and DAOs that are thinking more about, okay, how can you use something like NFTs to do governance across contributors? Index has done some really interesting experiments with, we have like OWL levels, which is sort of like a proxy for your amount of context in the organization. And different OWL levels have different weights in voting decisions and in coordinate allocations and all of these things. So you can do things like that. OrcaProtocol, the way that they're implemented is actually like your membership to a pod, which is kind of like a working group, is an NFT. And so like you can actually use those NFTs to essentially like create voting strategies on something like Snapshot. So there's a lot of ways where you can, instead of using tokens exclusively, pull in other ways of thinking about who is a contributor and who has a vote. But I think in that context, there are always downsides to every one of these. So it's more about like weighing the pros and the cons and thinking about how these things are allocated and how power is allocated. Again, I think like the governance mechanism that you use for making these decisions matters a lot. Are you doing consensus based voting with like needing to reach a certain minimum amount of people voting with a token? Are you doing a mix of those things? Like you could certainly do, people who are active contributors in Index with certain OWL levels are 60% of the vote. The other 40% is token holders. So you can play around with all of those different models. But I think ultimately the really important thing that this boils down to is giving people with the highest context more influence over the governance system, as opposed to like thinking about it as an incentive mechanism, because I think a lot of those things follow, though they are still really important.
Yep. All right. Thank you for sharing that. I wanted to ask you, like, are there any like interesting types of DAOs which you have seen recently, and you thought like, I wouldn't see something like this, or like, using DAO to like, a completely in a innovative way. So like, good use of DAO.
I just think about that.
Yeah. So, guys, as Chase is thinking, if you guys are enjoying this conversation, please share about the spaces, tag Chase, tag me. And yeah, if you're enjoying, just do some reactions so we know you guys are listening and haven't slept off already.
I think one of the most interesting DAO uses of a DAO that I am very excited about still is, even though it happened over the summer, is the crypto cookout. So if people know of Sursu, he's building Blackhand, which is also a very cool use of a DAO. But Crypto Cookout was this movement to buy black and brown punks, like crypto punks, because punks that are like white punks are way more expensive than black and brown punks.
Yeah.
And so they did a party bid, which for anyone who doesn't know is like you can sort of crowdsource money to buy an NFT, to buy black and brown punks at the floor and like increase the floor basically for them. And then they fractionalized ownership of these NFTs, and everyone had an ERC20 that represented their partial ownership in this NFT. And to me, what was really powerful about that as a DAO, like a lot of people have done like crowdsourcing to buy something, though Crypto Cookout was like among, I think, the first really big movements to do that. It came well before Constitution DAO and all that stuff. So it sort of, I think, paved the way. But what's really interesting to me about that is that ownership for the longest time has been a tool for only the wealthiest, most powerful people to influence society. So when you think about ownership over territories and ownership over economies and ownership over liquidity, like all of these things have given rich, powerful people more power to control and sort of move society in the direction that they want. And so ownership more broadly is like a very foundational aspect of our social fabric and the way that we organize as humans. And I think what the Crypto Cookout demonstrated is that it can be used as a tool for a social movement, which is effectively what the Crypto Cookout was. So the longer term plan for a lot of the Crypto Cookout is actually to buy like and support Black artists and all these things. And so I think when we think about what ownership can really mean in this ecosystem and society more broadly, like when you make that accessible to groups of people in the same way that Twitter actually influenced a lot of the Arab Spring by giving people a tool for coordination, I think ownership can be the same way. And those types of uses of DAOs where we're really saying we're going to leverage collective ownership to make a change in the social fabric of our society and really like change something like the floor price for black and brown punks. To me, that's powerful. I mean, even when you think about like Ukraine DAO and what they're doing, that's powerful. So I'm very excited about, and I guess excited is a strange word. I think that the power of ownership to influence our social fabric is incredibly underestimated. And I think it's one that we're going to see take off over the next 5 to 10 years in the same way that social media totally changed the fabric of our society.
I mean, that's super interesting. Thank you for sharing that. I did not know about what these guys did, and yeah, we've seen like a lot of discrepancy in like floor prices when it comes to black and brown punks or me bits. It's there, right? Like there's a white premium on other NFTs. Anyway, Chase, what are like? Can you tell us about the red flags you see in DAOs, right? Like when you see certain things, it's a red flag.
I try not to be I've almost done some red flag tweets, but I try not to because there's always an interesting reason behind why people do stuff. That's a good question. I don't think it's a red flag per se. I just think that a lot of teams need to be more intentional about this. But going back to this notion of teams that are progressively decentralizing need to be really intentional about who is in charge of and has a say in what. I think one of the things that's happening now that is definitely challenging, and again, like I don't think this is a malicious red flag. I think this is something that is just, it emerges because people sort of only know certain organizational models and they don't think about these things. But I think we really need to be more careful about making things more explicit. Like even within Orca, for example, we're going through this where we're saying, okay, what is within the domain of the DAO and what do they have power and control and say over? What is within the domain of Sonar Labs, which is the company that's building Orca? And how do these two groups like fit together in this broader ecosystem? And how can we make those things more explicit? And one of the main reasons that we're doing this is, I think a lot of companies like don't want to do this because they don't want to make people within their DAO think that like the DAO doesn't have power, and they don't want to like explicitly say we're centralized. But the problem is, like, if you don't very intentionally create those statements and explicitly state where you're at today, even if it's not where you're going, it's very hard for people to engage in that system in a way that's where the power dynamic is like something that feels fair. And also, you can't really easily change those systems and say, hey, currently this company that started the DAO owns X, Y, and Z. As the DAO, we would really love to take over X. Let's create a proposal to do that and get consent from the company, consent from the people in the DAO, and let's decide on this together. So basically, like, if you don't make those things explicit, the system can't be really evolved by anyone except for the people who hold that power. And so I think that to me is, and I wouldn't want to call it like a red flag because, again, I don't think it's intentional, but I think that that's something that communities and particularly like these more centralized companies need to be a lot more intentional about when you're building and sort of using this like rhetoric of giving the community power. Like, you actually need to be very explicit about what that means.
Yep, that makes sense. I want to ask you just the state of DAO tooling. Like, where do you think we are at? Because I've seen a bunch of people who are transitioning from Web 2 to Web 3. Their first thing they want to build is DAO toolings. And then we have a lot of people who have contributed to a lot of DAOs, and they are like uh going and building DAO tools as well. So like this is what I see from my lens. But like, what is your take on the state of DAO tooling?
I think across the board, it's funny because like startup advice, just traditional startup advice, is like validate that your product is something that people would want to use before you go and build an entire company around it. And I think generally DAO tooling is the same. I think some of the best DAO tooling is helping scale or codify or whatever it might be a design pattern that humans already use, and that sort of like help humans thrive, as opposed to like forcing a square peg into a round hole. And I think that a lot of the best DAO tooling is in some capacity emulating like a pattern that already works, that has already been validated in some human organization. And I think it's definitely helpful for founders who are going to build DAO tooling to have contributed to a DAO, but I'm less and less convinced that that's like the most necessary thing, because again, going back to this question of like, what is a DAO? Like Madam Cult Leader, who I'm a big fan of, if you're not following them, highly recommend, they're in the audience, but they've been tweeting about like, what's a D-org versus a DAO? And like, ultimately what that tells me is how you even quantify what it means to quote unquote have contributed to a DAO before you build a DAO tool is just like, it's way too ambiguous. And so I think ultimately the best DAO tools and the people who are building DAO tools ideally have been part of some movement that was like a decentralized organization of people who are coordinating in some capacity, and they are trying to build some puzzle piece that was useful to them when they were coordinating. And that could be a bunch of different things. Like DAOs are not the only capacity in which people have ever organized in a decentralized way. In fact, they're a very small percentage of activists and indigenous communities and self-managing orgs. So like, I think what matters a lot more is that you've existed in a context where people have organized in a decentralized manner than like you being someone who has been a contributor to a DAO. But all that comes back to like, you really should have you should have some validation that like this pattern.
Yeah, and can you give us any examples of this happening? Like, if something was validated in a DAO, and people went on and built a tooling system around it. I think what I know is Yon was using the coordinate, started from there. So are there any more such examples which you can think of?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because so before Coordinate was built, Zach had used a sort of similar version of this system at Converge, which was like a company that he started and had worked for years before they started using something like this at Yearn. So actually, like, that concept comes from something that Zach had tried, which I'm sure came from another community, which came from another one. So like most of these things have already been tried by different groups. It's just a question of like identifying the source. Another good example of this that's not even explicitly a DAO tool, but that now DAOs are exploring using is Murmur, which is from one of the hosts of the Brave New Work podcast, who wrote the Brave New Work book, works at the Ready, which is like working agreements. And now they've implemented signing in with wallet capabilities, but that all came from their work with organizations that were becoming more self-managing, that were implementing like sociocratic self-management principles that now were used in this software. And I'm sure that goes way back to different communities. So like most of the DAO tools I think that we're seeing that are picking up some steam, like are versions of a lot of practices that probably started hundreds, if not thousands of years ago in some capacity. And now these are sort of like the latest versions that are useful in this context. But yeah, I think a lot of DAO tools are like this. Even like Orca is codifying pods, which are working groups, which are like units of functional humans that have existed for so long. So I think a lot of this is always can be traced back to like groups of people that are not even near the current type of work that we're doing today, that have figured a lot of this stuff out.
It's I think it's just interesting to see that I was just watching a book I was watching a YouTube video of this person who was talking about why he like why learning several languages sucked. That was, I mean, it was just a rant, and he was talking about, like, what we learn in our small little bubble of our history of whatever uh, content we consume or history we learn has already been done before, or is very similar in other cultures as well. And like nothing you do is not necessarily new, and it's all been done before. And it was just like a sad YouTube video. He was just trying to prove a point that, like, whatever you're thinking has been done before, maybe not in this context, but in some other context. And I think it's just like using history, or like learning more about different spaces, and like bringing it to DAOs can also be helpful.
Oh yeah, totally. And I think that there's also something really beautiful in saying there have been a lot of people that have spent so much time and energy and like really intentionally built cultures around these structures. How can we honor that by learning from it instead of ignoring it? And I kind of feel like there's something really powerful in doing that. And of course also like ideally in referencing this kind of work and things like that, and actually like acknowledging that that's where a lot of this knowledge comes from. But I think there's something very beautiful to that too, because it means that the things that they were experimenting with aren't just ending there, like that very intentional crafting and thinking about these things lives on in different contexts. I think there's something really, really beautiful and powerful to that too.
Yep, I agree. So, Brenna, I hope I pronounced your name right. You have a question. Happy to take that one.
Yeah, thank you for bringing me up. I just wanted to hop in real quick and then I'll hop out. First, I want to say, Chase, I have been listening to your DAO mini-series and it's been amazing. So if y'all haven't checked that out, you definitely should do that. It's been so educational. I just like take notes every single time I'm listening to it. But also I want to say that definitely, I think that the motivation behind the fact that there's nothing new under the sun, I think it's like more motivation to be original rather than just trying to be different. At least personally, when you realize that everyone's trying to kind of do, it seems like they're doing similar things, or like these things have already been done. I think it motivates us to be more original in our journey. But anyways, my question was for Chase. She mentioned token deflation, which is interesting. I haven't heard that before. But my question is, how can you, I guess, still implement generational wealth / passive income for those who did come in early? And is this even something that's necessary for the DAO space? Because I know that's more of like a NFT feature, is kind of that passive income / generational wealth. I'm wondering if that's even applicable here in that the token deflationary aspect. But that was my question.
I love that question. And I also so appreciate that you listened to the podcast. I'm so glad it was helpful. Yeah, I think like when I think about like inflationary tokens and sort of diluting early contributors who are no longer involved, I think you're bringing up a really interesting point, which is like the general thought behind it is how can we reduce the governance power of people who effectively like are no longer actively having enough context to like really have that strong of a voice in governance. I think longer term, what we might end up seeing is the decoupling of ownership and governance power, or at least a little bit more separation. To me, ownership and the notion of ownership being this way to create generational wealth is one of the things that NFTs are really, really great at. And I think DAOs have the potential to do that. I think it's like definitely relevant in this conversation around DAOs. And so I think one world that could exist is one in which ownership and governance power are slowly decoupled. I also think like the fact that there are quite a few crypto companies based in the US and the SEC is watching closely has changed our willingness to decouple these things. But I think there is a world in which you could have governance power that's inflationary, that has this element where earlier contributors like don't have as much of that governance power, but they maintain ownership potentially. That's one option. But I also think that like new contributors should be able to build this like generational wealth as well. And so I think there are opportunities to be thinking more about how could you have, staking that earns you more tokens and ownership, but perhaps not governance power, or even how can we just create systems that allow people to lend their governance power in a way that feels in line with their values, which is a whole other conversation, and actually earn interest on it. And so I think that there are a lot of ways and systems that we can be building that allow people to build wealth and create and be able to like really leverage economic opportunities while also taking into account that like people who are coming into these systems also should have the opportunity to build that wealth. So I think that's a really interesting question. I have to think more on that, but I really like that perspective and thinking. There's a lot there to think through.
Thank you. That was an awesome answer. I'll be thinking more through it as well.
Very cool, very cool. Guys, if you have any questions you want to ask Chase, you can request. And Chase, I want to ask you a NFT question. A lot of, very recently you might have seen the Bored Ape launched a coin, and they are making a DAO, right? Like for the ape coin, right? Like, so do you think there will be a transition of these big NFT projects into DAOs? And what do you think about how where will the intersection of NFTs and DAOs be at?
To me, there are like two things happening here. I think, again, more broadly, as we start to decouple tokens and governance power, I actually think NFTs are going to be a really big tool in helping give people who don't own tokens, but instead own NFTs, governance power. It's just you can have more metadata. Like there is a lot more that you can do with NFTs as governance tools as opposed to tokens exclusively. You can be more intentional about crafting who has like basically how much weight and all of that kind of stuff. So I think NFTs in the context of DAOs is one world. I think more around like what you're thinking, I'm not entirely sure how this is going to play out. I am not as close to the NFT space. I mean, of course, I think like everything in Web3 still feels relatively small, but and this is probably still like a little bit of an uninformed thought. I'm not sure that this is entirely like if I thought more about it, I don't know if I would definitely think this, but my inclination is to think that most communities that are native to Web3 will be DAOs. Again, question around what a DAO is technically is like a big one. But if you think about self-managing, owned by the people who create value in them, like I think that that's what most Web3 native organizations will ultimately become. Just because that's kind of the nature of how these things evolve. I know Madam Cult Leader has thoughts on D-org versus DAOs and how we define those things. So I'm curious to hear what you think on this.
Am I good to speak? I wasn't sure if I could speak. I just had a question.
Yeah.
I just had a question, but I'll speak on it.
Yeah, I'm curious to hear what you think about this.
Yeah. So, okay. So my question was gonna like frame, and I was gonna try to get your opinions on it, Chase. But like, I think what we're seeing ultimately, like I've been tweeting about this a lot, where it's like Web3 is as new as Web2 is. Like, when did like Facebook come out? The mid 2000s. When did Bitcoin come out? The late 2000s, right? Like, when did you come out? Early, like mid 2000s again. Ethereum was 2015. So like people talk about them as like oppositional forces, but I almost think of them as like fraternal twins, right? Where it's like they emerged out of the womb at the same time. And people are like being like, well, this one's different in this way. And it's like, yeah, duh. So what that goes into is I think what we're seeing is the economic layer of Web3, right? Where it's like you can economically transact on the blockchain, and the social and like, just like, on your phone, on your computer, I don't know, like that technological layer allowing us to coordinate, and those two things smashing together, right? And they're smashing together and creating a synergy that is now we don't need to go into the office to economically, socially, or organizationally coordinate. So that's why I use the word D-org or digital organization, because I think that's really underpinning what we're seeing as the trend, where it's like the trend we're seeing is that like as someone who grew up on the internet, if I want to produce a physical product, it's a little bit different, right? If I want to make like, I don't know, if I want to do like chemistry, which was my major and what I did for a while, I have to go into a lab and mix chemicals and do that. But if I'm doing something that's consumer based or that's not a physical product, then why do I need to be in the office? Why do I need to coordinate in physical space with people? So I think Web3 plus Web2, right, thinking of them as fraternal twins, is catalyzing a movement of digitization of organizations. And that is a movement that is unique to millennials and Gen Zs, right? Boomers and Gen Xs are not doing that. It's us that are going to do that. So we're building tools for that movement to online space, right? Where we don't have to be in the physical space with each other to organize with each other, which is historic for humans, right? This is like so modern, it's never existed before. So like, that's why I say D-org, because I think DAO is like a weak capture of the movement. Because I mean, my question to you, Chase, is going to be like, why can't regular organizations, nonprofits, co-ops, consumer companies use DAO tooling? You know what I'm saying? Like, and that's how I think about For Wonder and building our community there. It's like, why do we have to say this is only for Web3 organizations? Why can't it be for a nonprofit? Why can't it be like, it's like there's no reason we have to like segment ourselves away from like general, company populations.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, this notion of like digital organizations is an interesting one too, because there are definitely physical organizations also that could be considered DAOs, but not like don't really have as much of a digital footprint, and they're not digitally native. Like something that comes to mind, I forget the name of the company, but when I had the people from the Ready, Aaron and Rodney, when we did our like crossover episode, they were talking about this one organization in, I can't remember if it was Sweden, it was somewhere, but basically they were like in-home nurses, and they effectively operated in this like very self-managed way. Every set of nurses that would go into a home like would sit with the patient and do things the way that they wanted to, instead of having this very hierarchical system. And that was like actually incredibly effective for them. And so I think there are actually a lot of elements at play here that we sort of capture into DAOs, because DAOs are at this, like, to your point, this convergence of like, digital spaces and wallets and like self-management. But there's actually a lot of combinations of these types of organizations, that you could have digital organizations that are more hierarchical, and you could have physical organizations that are more decentralized. And so I think that like that's a really actually large piece of this. And I think DAO only captures, a small part of it. And to your point about tools, I think some of the best tools will ultimately be useful for a lot of these combinations of orgs. Like if Wonder can't be used by these nurses, if that would be useful, then like I would ask myself, I wonder, not to use Wonder again, but like I wonder why that is, like is it that these things are because they're physical, there's something that makes them unique. And so I think there's probably a series of circles that are like, it's not just a Venn diagram. There are probably 3 or 4 circles, and figuring out where your tool fits within there is actually, I think, a really interesting exercise. I really love that framing. And
many thanks. Another last thing I'll say, I don't want to hijack too much, but last thing I'll say is that like the way I think about it is like squares are rectangles, but rectangles aren't squares, right? I think the same way of like DAOs, right? All DAOs are DAOs, but not all DAOs are DAOs. I hope that like makes sense to people.
It makes so much sense.
Shape focus. I should tweet these things out. I'm happy this is recorded, but like
you should.
Anyway, thought leader things. Chase. You know how it goes.
I love it. Please tweet it. Please tweet that.
Yep. Thank you for sharing your views, Madam Cult Leader. Shiv, and yeah, you should definitely tweet that. Go for it. Shiv J, you have a question. Yeah, you can unmute yourself, Shiv J.
Hi.
What's up?
Hi, Dheeraj.
Hi. Tell me.
This is Shivram. Previously, I have attended so many Twitter spaces. Okay, of your one, W3WD. Okay, just I would like to start a DAO, financial DAO. Is there any company particularly mentioned for DAO development, like third-party company? Like they develop the DAO and like they work for us.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any company like that?
So let me try to get your question. Tell me if I'm correct. Are you asking that is there any company which develops DAOs and give
DAO
you?
for us.
And
Like,
what does develop mean, right? Like I would like to know that.
yeah, it's a financial DAO. Okay.
Okay.
Like Olympus, but not
Okay.
we are not going to copy the code of Olympus like others. We go for like new code, and Olympus their strategy is different, and my thoughts are different from Olympus. But
So
is
okay. So
for
I get
financial.
you want to let me try to get this. Correct me if I'm wrong. Okay, Shivjay. You
Mm-hmm.
want to build a DAO like Olympus, but
Yeah,
you will
like
fork it
Olympus,
to
but
let me complete. Let me complete.
uh,
Right.
uh,
And if I'm correct, then yeah.
yeah, Dheeraj,
One sec.
actually, I'm not getting your voice properly. Dheeraj?
Oh, can you hear me, Ashu?
There is a problem. Yeah, you're audible. I could not hear you.
Uh, can Shivjay, can you come in a better network area? I think because everyone else is able to hear me. But I think I got your question. If not, just DM me your question, and I'm happy to take it with Chase. Okay. Yeah, but Chase, what I think he meant was is there I'm not sure actually. Now I'm more confused. Like, so I think he wanted to fork Olympus DAO and change its tokenomics, which is a lot of people have done it in the terms of the code way, and you can also do it and add on to different Ponzinomics or whatever they call it. And I think it's a very code related thing, right? Like if you find a Solidity dev who is able to change the what do you say, the code, it's doable. Chase, did you understand the question, or you have any other thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I guess there are probably two different ways to approach this question based on exactly what develop sort of entails. I think one of them is how do you physically write the code, which is you set up a Discord server and you have whatever your mechanisms for coordination are, and then you actually try to attract developers or find people that who are developers and sort of bring them in as early contributors and change the code and all of that kind of stuff, and then build out from there very tactically, if that's the question. The other side of it, though, is what tools are there or third parties are there to help you build a DAO more broadly. I think the base sort of set of tools often is Discord, starting with a Gnosis safe multi-sig, which is usually the foundation for a lot of these organizations. And then you have tools like Wonder, which are really fantastic as you scale, thinking about how you manage work within the organization. Orca is doing things around pods, which is going to slowly have some announcements around when people can start playing around with it. Discourse is very popular as a forum just to have conversations about these things. GitHub is still the pretty standard thing that people tend to use. Radical has some similar, I think not totally similar functionality, but is more on the software development side, which is really fun. My company Decentology is playing around with how you can create these more modular smart contracts that people can use, especially developers who aren't super familiar with Web3. So there are a lot of tools out there, and there are lots of DAO tooling lists and things on Twitter as well that you can play around with and start using. So yeah, I think the base way to start building the DAO itself is getting people in a Discord and starting to figure out what work needs to get done, who's doing what, and one of the most important things is how do you decide who's going to do what, and how do you as a group, make decisions and all that kind of stuff. But that would be the two-pronged answer depending on what development really means to you.
Yep. Thank you for sharing that. And I did pin some tweets from Orca and Decentology. So, you can refer. Chase went with a long list. I couldn't physically pick up all the tools they have mentioned. But, I'm happy to write a small summary and list all these tools and all these small, make small clips so you can digest this content more easily. So we will be doing that. And yeah, if you have any questions to ask me, if not, I think we could probably end it here. Chase, any closing thoughts? How can people reach you? How can they get started with DAOs? And yeah, I don't think I wanted to ask you this. I completely forgot that people say if you want to join DAO, just join their Discord, but it's super messy when it comes to it. What are your thoughts, right? What's the best onboarding, or what's the how do you get people involved?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's this whole notion and narrative around, oh, just join a Discord. And I also push this narrative. So it's not I'm oh, people say this. I say this all of the time. So I'm guilty of really pushing this narrative as well. I would say the modifier on it is yes, join a Discord, start introducing yourself and getting on public calls and sort of sharing what your interests are. There are two other things that I think are really important. The first is understanding what kind of work do I want to do? How are people paid for that work? How do I know that that's work that would be compensated? Because what I think you don't want to do is spend a bunch of time doing work that you think you're going to be compensated for, that you actually aren't compensated for, and all of that kind of stuff. And that doesn't mean introducing yourself in Discord and saying, hey, I'm this person, how do I get paid? It just means you're aware of that and conscious of that, which I think is important. I think that that's a narrative that's sort of misleading right now in the space. And the last thing that I want is for people to go in and do a bunch of work and then feel like it was for nothing. But the second thing that really matters a lot is doing this in an organization that's I think kind of early is a little bit easier. So the earlier a DAO, I think the easier it sometimes is to really start to get involved in a meaningful way. depending on the kind of skill you want to do, obviously, but there are certain DAOs that are going to really welcome you with open arms regardless of what you're doing. And there are other DAOs that are a little bit further along that kind of have a better idea of their exact needs. And there might already be people working on the thing that you want to work on, and it doesn't quite make sense to have like redundancy of work. And so that's where you have a situation where, it's a little bit sometimes more challenging to just go into a DAO that's a little bit later stage and be like, I want to work on this, someone support me. And so I think that matters a lot too. So yes, you go into a DAO, into a Discord, you introduce yourself, all of those good things, but also recognize like contextually, where is the organization at? What are their needs? Is there alignment here on what I would like to work on and what the organization needs, or is there not? And if there's not alignment, that's totally fine. That just means, that means maybe consciously deciding to not contribute. And alignment could be in payment, or it could be in something like the type of work you want to do. Those are all things to consider and really like think about intentionally.
Yep, that makes sense. Shiv J, is your like? Do you want to ask your question, and then we can close?
Yeah. It's not question, Dheeraj. Actually, a little suggestion.
Yeah.
Dheeraj, you have a YouTube channel.
I do not have an active YouTube channel. No.
Yeah, it's not active. That's what I got it. And you have a YouTube channel. Why don't you post all these conversations in your YouTube channel? If someone misses, suppose today's space.
Yep. So that I honestly, yeah, that's what that's yeah. Sorry, go on. I will let you continue.
Yeah. That's it. Just I am requesting you to post all these conversations in YouTube. In future, it will be like a reference. And see if someone misses today or yesterday's something space,
Yeah,
okay, they can open your YouTube channel and they can go through the discussions whatever happened.
I agree 100%, and we are actively working towards it. We are also trying to distribute this on um podcasting platforms like Spotify, Apple Podcast by
Mhm.
Google, and all these things as well. It's
Yeah.
just we've started this month, and I've just been doing a, a bunch of these spaces, just trying to be regular. We're doing one almost every day, except the weekends, because weekends we are taking time off for ourselves. But this is in the plan, and we also want to do short clips, because I understand not everyone wants to listen to every bit of it, and maybe someone just wants to listen to what toolings someone should a DAO should start with. Like, we could have the Chase clip talking about all these awesome tools that she mentioned, and yeah, that's also like a good content. So we are working on it. It's not that this thing, we have created a new channel as well, and yeah, soon it will be live. Soon everything will be going there, and hopefully, even if you miss all these conversations, you can catch it up. And for also, if you want to hear more of Chase, there is this podcast she runs, is uh the other, my god, did I just yeah, I think it's called the other pod. Oh my god.
It's on the other side, but
Other,
yes, it's in my bio also.
yeah, it just blanked.
Yeah. Other side part. That
Yeah,
XYZ.
but it's
Yes.
side pod. Yeah. Awesome. You check that out. Chase also has an active grant on Gitcoin. You can go and contribute to it. That would be pretty cool. I did contribute in the morning, and I also have an active grant called Web3 with the educational Twitter Spaces. This is my first time I joined Gitcoin. I was super excited and nervous, thinking oh, what if this doesn't get approved? What if my show is not a public good? But they think otherwise, and it's live. I was super excited. We didn't share it with anyone until now, but do check it out. Yeah. And Chase, please follow Chase.
Yeah,
Tweets.
yeah, yeah. I'm following her.
Yeah,
And
this is for
yeah,
everyone. This is
I
for
everyone.
Yeah, hi, Chase. I will go through all your podcast.
Awesome, awesome. Thank you, Shivjay. I think we're just closing the conversation,
Okay,
and
thank you. Good night.
good
Good
night.
night. Good day. Good day. Bye.
Nice. Uh, so yeah, please follow Chase. You can also follow me if you don't follow me already. I'm doing these spaces Web3 with Dhee. We're talking mostly about the Ethereum ecosystem, NFTs, DAOs, DeFi, and all the fun stuff. Like Chase, even I like to talk about the people behind the things they are building, so we get these people who are either CEOs or investors or community leaders or just some awesome people we see in the community, and just get to know them and understand their perspective, because Web3 and crypto is way beyond just talking about price and like, token go up, token go down, when Lambo and all that. It's fun for 3 days, and then, like, you can do so much, and there is still, like, life changing generational wealth kind of thing to be made, because, like, we're just getting started, and a lot of organizations which will be dominant in 10 years haven't even been formed yet. So yeah, that's my view. Thank you everyone for joining. I just want to say thank you to Addy, Scorsese, Nova, Evil, Rohit, DW, and Villian, no name, Tommy, Lucian, intern, Dev, and all these other guys who've been here for a really long time and listening to us talk about DAOs. And like, you could be doing anything in your day and you're still here. Thank you, Chase, for like, removing your time, being here, talking so patiently about all the questions I've asked. Thank you, Ashu, for helping me set this up. And Chase, if you have any closing thoughts, do let me know.
I don't think so. Thanks so much for hosting this. This was fun.
Awesome. All right, guys. See ya. Good night.